Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, thank you for speaking with us.
You're most welcome.
Our conversation today is going to focus primarily on Singapore's relations with the United States. And obviously, it's because you have a visit close on the horizon,
Yes.
Vice President Kamala Harris. It's going to be a big visit. Singapore has also had recently Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin as well. And the Biden administration has also nominated an ambassador here
Yes.
after a couple of years without an ambassador. Would you say then that relations are now on a different track, a more familiar track for you?
Well, I would say that actually relations have always been on track. And I think it's worth emphasizing the point that through successive administrations, both Democrats and Republicans, we've actually had excellent relations with them. And let me just give you a few data points. You will remember that PM Lee was invited by President Obama to a state dinner. I think that was in August 2016. In 2017, President Trump invited PM Lee for an official visit. I remember we stayed in Blair House again. In 2018, President Trump was here for the Trump-Kim summit. The year after, PM paid a working visit, and I remember him and President Trump signing the Protocol of Amendment of the MOU for the use of our facilities by the United States. So you'll see that, in fact, there has been a steady tempo of meetings and interactions. But clearly, COVID-19 kind of upended all that. And whilst it's true that we've had video conferences, phone calls, to be honest with you, diplomacy does need face-to-face interactions. You need to look into people's eyes. You need to have some time, sometimes just to relax and have a one-on-one conversation. So anyway, coming back, the visit by Vice President Kamala Harris is a very welcome, important visit. It's in fact, I think, her first visit to Asia. And, I think everyone's looking forward to meeting her in person and to renew the agenda and the engagement in the years going forward.
Yeah, her first visits outside of the US were Mexico, Guatemala. People sort of expected that. You can see the reasons behind it. Now she's chosen Vietnam and Singapore. What do you make of their decision to come to Asia and Southeast Asia as a first stop for her?
Well, if you look at the pattern of the Biden administration's diplomacy, in a sense, is a bit more conventional. Right? They try to engage multilaterally. They engage quite systematically with their allies, their partners, and other stakeholders. And I think it's quite, in keeping with that tone and that pace for her to reach out to Southeast Asia, and in particular Singapore. We're a city-state right in the heart of Southeast Asia. Vietnam, another emerging mid-sized major country in Southeast Asia, and I'm sure she'll be covering other parts of the world in due time.
I'm sure your colleagues in cabinet and in government have really, I can imagine, quite long ties with President Biden himself.
Yes.
Both as Vice President for 8 years and then in the Senate and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Yes.
Give us a sense a little bit more. You mentioned a bit of that, about his vision of foreign policy and where Asia fits into it.
Well, you are absolutely right. President Biden is someone who does not need any tutorials in foreign policy. He's completely familiar with it. But beyond just subject matter, I think the point is that, now I recall my first meeting with him. This was again in August 2016, for the state dinner. He comes across completely friendly, relaxed, avuncular, perhaps. I remember him sharing he recalled his meetings with former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. He remembered his visit to Adam Road Hawker Centre. So at a personal level, he's really very personable, very engaging, very charming. He puts a brilliant smiling face to American diplomacy.
I wanted to jump on the point that you made just now about the more traditional approach, including towards things like multilateralism.
Yes.
If we look back on the previous administration and the approach that they took on issues ranging from the WTO to the WHO to the Paris Agreement on climate change, Singapore has always cooperated quite deeply with the United States on
Yes.
issues like multilateralism.
Yes.
Was it a challenge for you then? And therefore, do you look forward to these coming years with the Biden administration with some different
Well,
viewpoint?
let me put it this way. I think President Trump was an unconventional president. So he did things and said things his way. It's his unique trademark. But I think it is also important to understand what President Trump represented. And there has been a change in global circumstances, a change in US domestic body politic. And he, in a sense, epitomized the anxiety, the concern of a very significant segment of the American domestic political opinion. So it's important to situate, his pronouncements and his actions in that light. So let's take a step back. After the end of the Second World War, in fact, the real clear winner was the United States. It was 40% of the global GDP. The United States established or was a key founder of a variety of multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, even WHO for that matter. It underwrote a multilateral system based on rules, based on a belief in free trade, the free economy, free flow of investments, the growth of multinationals. So in a sense, it envisioned, it underwrote, it implemented and effected this rules-based global multilateral system that we all have taken almost for granted for 7 decades. And it's worth making the point that in fact this has been a recipe for peace and prosperity, and especially for us in Singapore, in Southeast Asia. And in fact, if you look at it at a global level in Asia, China has also in fact been the biggest winner of this multilateral system with free trade, flow of investments, access, and engagement. So that's where it started. But you fast forward 50, 60 years from that time. The United States now is about a quarter of global GDP. So it's still big, but it's not the big behemoth that it used to be. And the nature of a multilateral rules-based system is that everybody, big or small, sometimes you will win, sometimes you will lose. When there's a case goes for arbitration or a case goes for a dispute before an international court, you win some, you lose some. Next point is that the rise of China has presented the United States with an unprecedented peer power, meaning one that is almost as strong, almost as big, has similar depths of technological expertise. This is a contest which America has never faced. If you go back to the Cold War and the USSR, the Soviet Union, yes, there was a Cold War, yes, there was an ideological battle, and yes, there were proxy wars. But in terms of economy, in terms of technological breadth and depth, it was an unequal challenge. Now, for the first time, it's facing, I believe, a peer competitor. And then you add the domestic elements within the United States. People's anxieties, especially in the Rust Belt, about globalization, about free trade, about competition. So you end up with a rather complicated and sometimes volatile mix, which has resulted in a rather polarized America. So therefore, coming back to Singapore's perspective, we have to take the world as it is. We see a transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. We see domestically, all over the world, including in Singapore, a political reaction against globalization and unfettered free trade. In fact, we also witness that it's hard to completely encapsulate or insulate free trade from politics. And sometimes people start getting worried if you're overly dependent on one or the other, and that economic account becomes a means to apply political pressure. So there's a geostrategic element as well.
Yeah.
So you add all this up, we understand, in a sense, what's going on in the United States. We understand that polarization makes it difficult for the United States to present sometimes a consistent narrative through different administrations. But I think we just have to learn to adapt, and this is par for the course. But coming back to the question of consistency and bipartisanship, I would say from a Singapore perspective, in terms of engagement, in terms of actual policy implementation, in terms of our economic account, our defense account, and our diplomatic engagement diary, it's been very good, and it's been consistent.
You raise many issues, and I'll get to them, from China to their own domestic polarization. But given all that as the larger context, then, are you confident at least that in these remaining 3 years and a few months, this Biden administration can push things a little bit along, especially on the economic trade front, whether it's bilaterally with Singapore or even generally multilaterally or plurilaterally, they can get back a little bit on track as far as openness and maybe even globalization, given especially domestic issues? Is that doable?
Well, they've got a lot on their plate. But at least if you listen to their pronouncements, they have said they believe in multilateralism, a rules-based world order. They announced that they're back in saddle as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned. They are engaging both at multilateral fora as well as bilaterally with all their important and key stakeholders, allies. Singapore is not a formal ally of the United States. We are in a rather unique category, a group of one, called a Major Security Cooperation Partner. Part of the reason for that is that Singapore, as a matter of policy, does not have formal alliances. But we do believe that America has been a constructive, significant presence and a significant pillar of the formula for peace and prosperity in Southeast Asia. America remains the largest foreign investor in Singapore. In fact, and this was a statistic I used to regularly remind President Trump, that America has more invested in Singapore. I think that number is about $318 billion US dollars. America has more invested in Singapore than it has invested in India, China, and Korea combined. I mean, many people are often surprised at that. And there are more than 5,000 American companies here. And all of them have been doing well. They have been a conduit for technology, for networks, for trade, for access. So again, if you look at the actual numbers, it's done very well. If you look in terms of trade agreements, You might recall that the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, in fact, began with a midnight golf game between Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong and then President Clinton. Subsequently, Mr. Goh and President Bush signed it in 2003. 2004, it came into effect. Since then, our trade with the United States has doubled. America remains our third largest trading partner. In fact, America is our largest trading partner in terms of services. And if you look both in terms of jobs in Singapore as well as jobs in the United States, which are directly or indirectly related to this economic account, there's no question. This is a vital, a growing, and an account which sometimes I think people don't give enough credit to.
Yeah, that's precisely, I mean, one of the very interesting things about countries' economic relations and foreign direct investment ties with the US, because you have companies, whether it's ExxonMobil, whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Coca-Cola. These are big names that people sort of instinctively know as global brands, but not necessarily as American brands.
Yes.
In a strange way, it hasn't added to the US's public diplomacy, so to speak. Do you agree that therefore it is intrinsically more difficult for people to understand the depth of the relationship? Even in the US itself, as you say, some people don't even know how big the account is.
That's true. Part of the reason is in the United States, there is a thriving corporate business sector which makes decisions on the basis of its own business interess.
Shareholders.
And shareholders' interests. It is not part of the political or state machinery. And this is actually a good thing.
That's the way it is, yeah.
Right? It's a good thing that when you're dealing with a multinational, you know that you're going to make decisions on the basis of business and not on the basis of politics. So in a sense, this is a design feature of the American system, and I'm saying that in fact it is a good thing. But it often leads to the point where people underestimate the importance of the American corporate sector. And in the case of Singapore, again, if you go back in time, Hewlett-Packard, Texas Instruments, National Semiconductor, they were here in the 70s, and that's why by the 80s, Singapore was a world-leading producer of electronics. I mean, in a sense, these were the vanguard of our electronics industry. And then you fast forward to today, all the big guys, Google, Amazon, Netflix, they all have data centers or engineering centers here, regional headquarters here, huge chunks of digital infrastructure and data centers are all here. So again, you see the economic logic has been there, and the fact that Singapore is an attractive place for investments. And by the way, if you recall, even last year we EDB reported record investments here. Another example of another significant investment, Global Foundries. They make wafers, semiconductors. And they've just put in $5.4 billion. It will create at least 1,000 high-end jobs. You will be producing, I would expect, something like 1.5 million semiconductor wafers per year. So the point is, American companies were a big part of our industrialization story. They continue to be a major investor and source of technology as we transit into the digital age. So again, the point is, people have not noticed, but it's worth emphasizing.
I'm sure you talk to all of them individually, but you also talk to them at the level of the US Chamber, the AmCham here, the US ASEAN Business Council. Do you think they sometimes feel people don't understand enough, whether it's in the US administration and the United States as well as in Singapore? What's the sense that you get from them?
Well, the other ministers and I interact regularly with them. So I think they are not short of attention from us, and they know that we understand and appreciate their critical role in our economy. We do make the point to them is that they often need to embark on more domestic campaigning in America,
Back home, yeah.
back home, and especially in Washington and in the halls of the Capitol.
I want to now talk about defense ties.
Yes.
You alluded to that. I mean, it has always been deep. It has sometimes been complicated. It's obviously been sensitive. We have, and it's quite foundational. You have the 1990 MOU, which you said obviously has been renewed. Give us a sense of how, in 1990, when you signed that MOU, Singapore and United States, what were the considerations in terms of setting the stage? That we are strong partners, but we're not, as you said, we're not allies. The US will say we are a place, not a base.
Yes.
How has that changed? How has the situation changed strategically between 1990 and now? You've mentioned China as well, but I'm sure regionally and strategically, things may have added on the plus side and maybe on the minus side in adding to the complication of how you deepen these defense ties.
Well, I would characterize it as plus. In fact, plus. And I would go back in time. When we became independent in 1965, a key design choice that we had to make, and even within the PAP, was not to be communist, but to open ourselves up to the world, to attract investments, to have industrial peace, to be able to export to new markets, to be able to bring in new technologies. And if you go back to the 60s, you will recall that we were still in the throes of the Cold War, and you could divide the world into communists or communist leaning on one side, free market, open economies on the other side. We were clearly in the latter camp. And I often remind my American colleagues that whatever their views now about the wars in Indochina, American sacrifice of blood and treasure in the 60s and 70s bought us time and space to prove that our economic model worked, and we were a success, and we were a beneficiary of that. So the point I'm making is that American involvement, engagement in this part of the world, economic, and then with the economy also having military interests to protect the economy, was actually part of the regional architecture that coalesced or formed in the 60s and the 70s. And then, of course, that significant large wave of American investments into Southeast Asia, and very big chunk of that in Singapore. Now, when the Cold War ended, late 80s, and the Philippines decided that they wanted the Americans to leave Clark and Subic. Now, there's no way, if you've been to Clark and Subic, you'll know how large they are. There's no way that Singapore could ever be a substitute for that. Nevertheless, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was categorical that America should not disengage from Southeast Asia, despite the fact that the Cold War had ended. And that's why this concept of places, not bases, came about. That's why the Memorandum of Understanding in 1990 came about. And over the years, the American Navy has become the largest foreign user of Changi Naval Base. Now, the other story, which we don't usually emphasize, but everyone knows it, we all serve national service. In terms of our equipment, defense technology, obviously we use quite a lot of American technology, which, and I would characterize that beyond just using tools, it's a question of trust. And it is another factoid or another index of trust is if I was to ask you, I often ask my American counterparts, which foreign country has more troops training on American soil than even NATO countries? And the answer, surprisingly, is Singapore, right? And that's because it gives us space, it gives us opportunities to train high-end, realistic training. So the result of that is that there is a very close institutional and personal links between our leaders and including our military leadership and theirs. And I would say a very large reservoir of trust and goodwill.
I'm going to use that concept of trust to talk about newer areas of cooperation, right? And there are quite a few areas of cooperation there. But I'll start with technology, where
Yes.
trust is going to be a key factor, a key metric in how countries are able to push forward in bilateral cooperation. In terms of technology, there are some who will say that, effectively we are moving towards a bifurcated, decoupled global arena, with the US on one side and potentially China on one side. And how far you can go with either one will depend a lot on trust, because one side may have limitations and constraints about how you may want to work with another side. Do you foresee that to be something to be concerned about, or do you think Singapore, as with other countries, will still be able to find a balance in pushing technology cooperation forward?
That's a very complicated question. But let's start with this question of competition. And again, if you go back in time, the transistor was invented in the United States. The computer was invented there, the personal computer. The internet was invented there. E-commerce, new ways of communication, video conferencing, and the rest of it. So we start with a world where, as I said, both economically and technologically was basically unipolar. America was number one. America was the inventor. America was the investor, the disseminator of technology. The rest of us were in a catch up, adopt, and then try to make our mark on the scene. And again, if you take that historically, China was also a beneficiary of that access to technology, that access to markets, and as a receptacle for investments, for FDI, including FDI from America. So your question then is, what has changed? What has changed is that as we transit to a multipolar world, and as China is no longer just catching up, but has every intention and ambition of overtaking where it can, at least in certain sectors, you now have real peer competition. So it is about understanding that these are unprecedented times. Now, in the past, the Americans would say, "Oh, don't worry, we'll compete, may the best man win." Right? But today, there's no guarantee that the best man will always be American. Then the question arises, and this becomes a domestic question: does America have sufficient self-confidence that in a fair, rules-based contest, it will always prevail? Or will it accept that sometimes it may not win the gold medal in every race? The point I'm making is that it's first and foremost a domestic question within America of their own self-confidence. And a more confident America can actually accommodate and make space for a peer competitor. And here's where things now get complicated. Because if the two superpowers can work out sufficient modus vivendi, rules of engagement, patterns and norms of behavior, so that they can compete, collaborate, contest even, and yet to do so within bounds that can build up a mutual experience that ultimately builds up trust. Trust from knowing that, it's not just one race, but we are going to be sitting around the same table time after time, engaging, competing, pushing, persuading, cajoling, and you build up trust. Then that can be, in fact, a start of another golden age in the digital arena, because the cumulative weight of investment and contest and innovation will unlock a tremendous burst of creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. That's the golden scenario. The opposite scenario is that if America believes, it must win at all costs, and it must change the rules if need be, or believes that China is getting ahead purely through unfair means, that immediately erodes trust. On the other side, and here I will speak from interacting with my Chinese counterparts, if they believe that America is a declining power, and it's not only their time in the sun, but that it is inevitable that they will win, we will also have a problem. I've tried to convince my Chinese friends that don't count America out. America's population may be 1/4 of China, but America's ability to attract the top talent from all over the world means the base of the American pyramid is actually far, far broader and deeper than China, so don't count them out. As Winston Churchill said, the Americans will do the right thing after they've tried everything else. But my sense of it right now, from my years engaging the Americans in Washington, in Capitol, and in Beijing and other places, is that on the American side, there's bipartisan suspicion, lack of trust, anxiety with China. On China's side, China also worries that America is not taking a benign and collegial approach to them. And all this talk of bifurcation, of economic sanctions, of denial of access to technology, I worry that we will end up with a self-fulfilling cycle where trust is depleted, bifurcation of supply chains occurs, which in turn leads to a bifurcation of technology, which must mean a world with slower progress. The rate of technological advancement will be disrupted. And then it will pose a problem for countries like us.
You point to the scenarios that are possible when the two countries are able to focus and cooperate
Yes.
despite competition.
Yes.
And automatically, the thing that comes to mind is obviously climate change
Absolutely.
under the Obama administration, where
Yes.
despite competition, at least leading up to 2015, they were able to work together towards the Paris Agreement at that stage in time. Obviously, it would have been a difficult 4 years since then, but do you think it's possible to move that now forward with the Biden administration?
On
And
climate
Singapore's
change, let me give you a very personal take. I spent 4 years
Yes.
of my life, and a lot of that time as a ministerial facilitator for round after round of negotiation that led to Paris Agreement. So let me tell you up close, Paris would not have occurred without ultimately the confluence and congruence of the United States and China. And I knew both the special envoys at a personal level very, very well. And I can tell you, without that duet between America and China, the Paris Agreement would not have occurred. Now you've just seen the latest IPCC. It's not amber lights, it's red lights. And we are likely to crack past the 1.5 degree threshold by 2030. If in the next 3 years we can't get America and China in the same room, sitting on the same table and doing what needs to be done for our planet, we're all in deep, deep trouble. So yes, there's an absolutely urgent need. So I guess what I'm saying is there is a potential glorious golden age if the two of them can work together. There is an urgent, existential threat on climate change, which again requires the two of them to get together. And for what it's worth, now I'll speak from a purely Singapore perspective. Singapore, where America is more invested than it has, in India, China, and Korea combined, where the American trading account, technology account is so big. But also Singapore, our biggest trading partner is China, and Singapore is the largest foreign investor in China. Can you see why we dearly want the two of them to get together? But of course, your question then is, well, you can wish that, but you can't make that happen. And I think what you're actually pushing me is to say, what are you going to do when things don't go according to plan? Right?
Right.
I will put it to you this way. For Singapore and our foreign policy, the existential imperative that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has always emphasized to us is relevance. We must make ourselves relevant so that others have a stake in our success and will want us to continue succeeding. So if you look into how we have actually implemented this dictum of relevance, we have been relevant to the Americans, to their economic interests, to their defense and strategic engagement to Asia. We have been relevant to China. You look at our government-to-government projects, our investments, the fact that we're now the largest foreign investor in China. If you look at Chinese companies also establishing regional or global headquarters or expanding even their digital footprints and their digital infrastructure, we have been relevant. So the point is, they all know that we have been useful, we have been relevant. But there is a difference between being useful and being made use of. You see that distinction? And I'm very, very clear in all my interactions, a lot of this is behind the scenes, that we will demonstrate relevance, we will be useful, but we will not be made use of. We will not become one or the other's stalking horse to advance negative agendas. Now, this is a difficult position to take because it means I don't have the luxury of saying different things to the Americans on one hand and the Chinese on the other. I say exactly the same thing consistently. I also make it clear that we're not taking sides, but we will take positions, depending on the issue, whether it's climate change, digital economy, cyber security, pandemics. Singapore will take position on issues according to our calculations of what is in our long-term national interest. But you are aware, as I am, that because Singapore is deemed to be a relevant, useful stakeholder, kind of almost like a reference customer, it does mean our people are subject to quite a lot of information and persuasion campaigns, which comes through social media, comes through messaging platforms. And this is something which Singaporeans need to be aware of. The fact that they are trying to persuade us actually is good. It shows that we are relevant. But always, always bear in mind, we are a multiracial city-state where trade is 3 times our GDP in the heart of Southeast Asia. We are relevant to both the United States, China, and Southeast Asia. And we will stay relevant only as long as we can maintain our independence, our space to pursue our own long-term enlightened national interests. So don't take sides, take positions on issues. So this has been a challenge. It will be probably a greater challenge in the years ahead. But that's where I need Singaporeans to understand the forces, the communications, the campaigns that are run, and to have an open mind.
Yeah, I mean, to start capping off then and to use that as a segue, what comes to mind is a recent Pew Center study on
Yes.
perceptions.
Yes.
And it will appear, and this is purely a snapshot, obviously,
Yes.
but it will appear that in this snapshot, favorable dispositions within Singaporeans towards China
Yes.
lean towards that rather than compared to the United States. When you look at studies like that, how does it concern you? What is it that you hope for? Do you hope that Singaporeans, as you say, keep an open mind, find some sort of balance? But again, depending on the situation, the balance may tilt in either way, depending on the issue as well. What's your main takeaway when you see something like that? And we have already spoken about the depths of the relationship with the United States. Is that something that you feel that sometimes is underestimated or diffused in the public perception?
Well, as I said, I mean, I think our relationship with America tends to be underestimated, both by the American public and the Singapore public. But setting that aside, what I hope for is a Singaporean public that is well informed, that understands the geostrategic forces that are playing out in this time and space, understands our own national interests, and we don't inadvertently get sucked into other people's propaganda or other people's agendas. So it requires confidence, information, and unblinkered view of our interests and of our future. So, in other words, like I said, don't take sides, take positions on whatever the issue is. Let's look at the facts, look at the data, look at the evidence. And from time to time, sometimes we will have to say this is right, that is wrong, or we support this or we don't support that. So coming back to polls are a snapshot of sentiment at a point in time, which is often affected by multiple factors, including the most proximate experience. So right now, for instance, the world is still in the grips of a pandemic. Lives have been lost, lives remain threatened. I think what people are looking for all over the world right now is good governance. I think forget the labels, communist, non-communist, all the debate about political forms. People just want good governance, meaning do you have a leadership that understands what's going on, understands the risk and the opportunities, that is able to communicate and explain and mobilize people to deal with clear and present dangers. I think that's what people are looking for, hungering for right now.
As a final question, and to talk a little bit more, therefore, about, as you are suggesting, the domestic situation here in Singapore. I mean, to use a quote from former Speaker of the US House, Tip O'Neill, he obviously meant this in a different way, but all politics is local.
Oh, yes.
And I would say that, foreign policy also ultimately is formed by local factors.
Yes.
As you see developments in Singapore, and we were talking about this, do you think it's made your foreign policy a bit more complicated, a bit more difficult, especially as it relates to relations with a big country like the United States and China, but maybe the United States for this conversation?
Well, my take on it, and I've repeatedly reminded my colleagues here, foreign policy begins at home. You first need to have a people united by an idea, a concept, a mission. In the case of us, we just celebrated 56 years. We are a multiracial city-state where all of us are equal, where with our backs to the wall, we've succeeded and we've got something to protect. Because we've got something to protect and because we have an identity and we have a citizenship and we have a passport, without all that, there is no foreign policy to pursue. Next point is because we have been reasonably successful so far in these 56 years, people take us somewhat seriously because they know we are successful and united. And when the Prime Minister says something, it will stick. It matters. It is implemented. It is done. That actually makes it so much easier for our diplomats and for me. Knowing that we come from a place people have heard of us, there is a brand name, we are united, we are coherent, we are consistent. So if you ask me to compare, to diplomacy 56 years ago, I would say we have it much easier, right? Because we have a successful, thriving, united Singapore. So it begins at home. Now, having said that, because we are now in uncharted territory, with the rise of China and the fact that America remains, by a significant extent, a leading superpower, and because of our unique position at that interface where we stand to gain so much opportunity if they get along well, there's a new set of challenges for us. All I ask for our local, for our own people, is keep our eyes wide open, take the world as it is, understand what's going on. And as I said, we will be useful, but we will not be made use of. And if we have that confidence, that wherewithal, that verve, the next few years will be exciting, exhilarating. So no, it's a very good time to be alive. It's a good time to be Singaporean. And the challenges that are going to unfold, both domestically and globally, will be great, especially for our young generation. You just imagine a world in which we will be leaders in the use of new digital technologies, of AI, of robotics, of new means of communication. Imagine a world where we're going to solve climate change. And again, with our green plan and our ability to adopt quickly and use new technologies. Imagine a world where trust is the most important currency, and the Singaporean reputation for good old-fashioned reliability, honesty, integrity, combined with imagination and verve. Think again of those opportunities for us. So, all these things keep me up awake at night, but it's born out of excitement and exhilaration, not fear and paranoia.
Well, on that very positive note, we all hope it comes to pass. Thank you very much, Minister Balakrishnan, and good luck on the visit by the Vice President.
Thank you. We're looking forward to that too.